Have you ever noticed how the loudest people are always the ones who know the least? How those who talk the loudest about everything seem to have absolute certainty, while the truly wise stay quiet in the corner. Diogenes, the Greek philosopher who lived like a beggar, had a terrifying insight, was surrounded by actors pretending to be wise. Why is it that those who really understand things usually keep their mouths shut? And why do the ignorant talk so much? Maybe because true wisdom makes people uncomfortable while pretending entertains them. If you've ever felt that something's wrong with this whole charade, get ready. Diogenes had a lot to say about the clowns who dominate our world, and his observations from 2,000 years ago are more relevant than ever. Imagine having to live alone because you see things that others refuse to acknowledge. That's the curse of thinking for yourself. Diogenes knew this bitter loneliness well. While fake sages surround themselves with followers who applaud any nonsense, those who truly see beyond remain isolated in their discoveries. Why does this happen? Because truth isn't popular. It doesn't sell cheap dreams or promise easy solutions. Truth demands work, doubt, constant questioning. Pretending, on the other hand, offers immediate comfort. Relax. I have all the answers you need. The true sage makes people uncomfortable because his mere presence exposes others' charades. He doesn't need to talk much or give grand speeches. His way of living already exposes who's playing a role. That's why they prefer to keep him away, as if honesty were a contagious disease that might infect the well-behaved. Diogenes experienced this firsthand. The more authentic he was, the more people avoided him. The more truths he spoke, the fewer dinner invitations he received. Society is allergic to sincerity because it messes up the organized little theater that everyone agreed to perform. This loneliness isn't punishment. It's the natural price of clarity in a world that prefers collective illusion. And those who pay this price discover something interesting. Being alone with truth is infinitely more valuable than being accompanied by comforting lies. The sage's solitude is preferable to the company of fools. We live in a society that has turned pretending into official currency. The more you appear to know, the more social value you accumulate. It doesn't matter if your answers are empty or contradictory, as long as they sound convincing to untrained ears. Fake sages have learned the basic trick. Speak with authority about any subject. Use difficult words that impress. Cite some famous names and you're done. People will treat you as an instant expert. It's like a game where whoever bluffs best takes all the social prizes. Diogenes saw this and laughed bitterly. He realized that society rewarded performance, never substance. Those who ask uncomfortable questions are labeled as problematic or destabilizing. Those who offer ready-made answers, even if completely wrong, are seen as useful and trustworthy. This perverse logic creates a self-destructive cycle. True thinkers withdraw from the public stage, tired of competing with clowns. Meanwhile, actors occupy all the central spaces, dictating rules of a game they invented themselves. The result is predictable. A society run by people who know how to perform wisdom but have never truly lived it. Experts at appearing intelligent, but completely ignorant about how to apply that intelligence in reality. And us, we're the audience applauding the play without questioning, paying admission to watch actors who don't even know their own lines. Pretending has become the most profitable profession in the modern world. The difference between real knowledge and intellectual posing is like the difference between someone who knows how to swim and someone who only knows the theory about swimming. When push comes to shove, when life demands practical results, the poser drowns spectacularly while continuing to quote swimming manuals. Nowadays, anyone can appear intelligent without much effort. Just memorize some catchy phrases circulating on the internet. Repeat what's intellectually trendy, and use fancy vocabulary in casual conversations. The problem is that difficult words don't make complex ideas more true or useful. Diogenes deeply despised this cheap performance. He knew that true wisdom is always practical, not theoretical. It's knowing how to live authentically, not knowing how to talk beautifully about how one should live. It's humbly accepting that we don't know everything instead of faking an erudition we don't possess. Real knowledge manifests silently because it doesn't need advertising. It shows itself through consistent actions, coherent choices, tangible results in a person's life. Intellectual posing, however, is necessarily loud because it depends completely on an impressionable audience. The fundamental difference is crystal clear. Those who really know something aren't afraid to admit their areas of ignorance. Those who pretend to know have absolute terror of being discovered as frauds. That's why one cultivates humility and the other cultivates defensive arrogance. Even more revealing, the true Noah constantly seeks to learn and correct their mistakes. The fake Noah seeks only to impress and defend their artificial reputation. One is always growing, the other's always pretending they've already grown. And us, can we make this crucial distinction? Or do we also fall into the seductive trap of confusing sophisticated vocabulary with genuine intelligence, diplomas with wisdom, fame with competence? Remember the story of the king who paraded naked because no one had the courage to point out the obvious truth. Diogenes would be that brave child who shouts fearlessly, "The king is naked." He had that rare audacity to call things exactly by the name they deserve. We live surrounded by naked kings in every direction. Politicians selling impossible promises, digital influencers giving advice about lives they've never lived, self-help gurus teaching success they've never achieved, expert commentators opining on subjects they've only studied superficially. All these characters parade wearing imaginary robes of wisdom and authority, while the crowd pretends to see luxurious fabrics where only raw vanity and disguised ignorance exist. The spectacle is so well mounted that even the actors themselves start believing their own fantasy. Why doesn't anyone point out the obvious that's staring everyone in the face? Because it's infinitely more comfortable to participate in the collective theater than to assume the thankless role of unmasking the main actors. Questioning established authority is work and brings unpleasant social consequences. Accepting that the famous expert might be completely wrong shakes all our comforting certainties. It's easier to outsource our critical judgment than to develop the painful capacity to think for ourselves. Diogenes didn't have this paralyzing fear of truth. He saw a famous philosopher being hypocritical and said it to his face publicly. He saw a politician lying shamelessly and exposed it without mercy. He saw society pretending virtues it didn't practice and mocked it without pity or mercy. This brutal courage comes with a high price. You become a mortal enemy of those who profit from organized lies. But it also has an invaluable reward. You stop living in others' fantasies and start seeing naked, raw reality. The question that remains is personal and non-transferable. Do you have the courage to be that child who shouts the uncomfortable truth? Or do you prefer to continue respectfully admiring the emperor's imaginary clothes? There's something objectively worse than not knowing, pretending that you know. Diogenes understood profoundly that honest, acknowledged ignorance is always the essential first step toward any real wisdom. But ignorance, carefully disguised as knowledge, is a bottomless pit that only deepens with time. Why do people systematically prefer to lie to themselves about what they know? Because admitting ignorance hurts brutally to the inflated ego. It's deeply humiliating to discover that we spent entire years repeating nonsense as if it were absolute scientific truths. It's terrifying to realize that our knowledge base in which we place so much confidence might be completely rotten from the foundation, that our firmest opinions might be just well-disguised prejudices. The fake sage builds his entire identity on top of what he supposedly knows. If he admits he was fundamentally wrong about important questions, who will he be after that discovery? This existential insecurity keeps him eternally trapped in his own lie. He prefers to defend completely flawed ideas until death, rather than face the identity crisis that would come with rethinking everything from scratch. It's safer to live in the familiar prison of ignorance than to assume the frightening freedom of starting over. But Diogenes saw unexpected beauty in honestly acknowledged ignorance. Those who have the courage to say, "I don't know," are completely free to learn without chains. Those who pretend they already know remain forever trapped in their own elaborate charade. Genuine intellectual humility is profoundly liberating, not humiliating as we think. It frees us from the exhausting necessity of defending unsustainable positions and opens us to unimaginable discoveries. The fear of admitting ignorance literally transforms us into prisoners of our own pride. We become condemned to eternally repeat the same wrong ideas, defending increasingly unsustainable positions, ferociously attacking anyone who dares question our established wisdom. It's doubly ironic. Those who have the humility to say, "I don't know," demonstrate more real wisdom than those who pretend to know absolutely everything. Diogenes not only knew this intellectually, he lived this truth without any social shame. Our era has created a new class of false prophets that's especially dangerous. The universal experts of everything. Just having an impressive diploma or appearing a few times in the media makes you an absolute authority on any imaginable subject. Diogenes would be horrified by this mass industrial performance. The real problem isn't the existence of legitimate specialists in their specific areas. The problem arises when they systematically exceed their limits of competence and start opining about absolutely everything as if they were omniscient gods of universal knowledge. Worse still, when we consciously use this limited technical authority to manipulate people who don't understand the specific subject. It's a sophisticated form of power abuse that Diogenes would combat without truce. How many times have you believed blindly in someone just because they displayed impressive academic titles? How many times did you fail to question a dubious idea because it came from a recognized authority? Diogenes would constantly remind you, titles don't guarantee truth. Diplomas don't eliminate stupidity. Modern false experts are updated versions of the sophists that Diogenes fought daily. They sell cheap illusions of wisdom to consumers who don't want to take the hard work of thinking for themselves. It's infinitely easier to outsource our critical judgment to external authorities than to patiently develop our own critical sense. More comfortable, too, until the day those authorities lead us to the precipice. This addictive dependence on external authorities progressively infantilizes us. We stop trusting our natural capacity to reason and become passive consumers of prefabricated opinions. It's exactly what professional manipulators most desire. Diogenes would challenge us head-on. Stop immediately delegating your brain to others. Question absolutely everything, especially those who present themselves as unquestionable. True authority never fears being contested. Only false authority flees from debate. Behind all intellectual arrogance publicly displayed, there's always a frightening existential void. The fake sage desperately needs to appear superior because he feels profoundly inferior inside. His constant arrogance is a defense mechanism, never a demonstration of real strength. Diogenes developed this perception by carefully observing the great intellectual names of his era. The more someone theatrically tried to appear wise in public, the more insecure and empty he really was in private. The compulsive need to impress others always revealed the basic inability to impress oneself. This compensatory arrogance manifests in very specific and recognizable ways. Automatic contempt for simple and direct questions. Explosive irritation when questioned about details. Neurotic need to prove intellectual superiority in any casual conversation. These are clear signs of someone who built a completely false identity and lives in constant terror of being discovered as a fraud. The person genuinely secure in their knowledge doesn't need to constantly prove anything to anyone. The true sage, on the contrary, doesn't feel the need to prove anything to any audience. He knows his real limitations well and isn't minimally ashamed of them. His genuine security comes from within, never from external approval or admiration. That's why he can be naturally humble without feeling diminished or threatened. He can admit mistakes without entering an identity crisis. He can change his mind without feeling he's betraying himself. The irony is crystal clear. The more someone desperately tries to appear intellectually secure, the more insecure they demonstrate being to any attentive observer. True confidence is always silent and serene. False confidence is invariably loud and defensive. Diogenes saw through this social mask as if it were transparent. He knew that behind every arrogant braggart exists a scared child, desperate for recognition and external validation. And he treated that child with the brutal sincerity it secretly desired but consciously feared. Never in human history has there been so much useless intellectual noise as today. Everyone has a formed opinion about absolutely everything in real time, without pausing even a second to reflect minimally. The contemporary fake sage reveals himself precisely in this neurotic rush to speak before thinking. Diogenes deeply valued reflective silence as a tool of wisdom. He knew from experience that the best ideas always emerge in contemplative quietude, never in the noisy tumult of endless discussions that lead nowhere. Those who need to shout their opinions to the world probably don't really trust them. Those who have genuine certainty about something Don't feel the need to constantly try to convince everyone. Observe contemporary social media carefully. Those who post the most content about wisdom and philosophy usually demonstrate less real wisdom in their actions. Those who debate complex issues online the most usually understand less about them in practice. The modern spectacle of opinion has completely transformed genuine reflection into social performance. Thought became a consumer product. Insight became entertainment. Wisdom became a personal brand. The problem isn't having opinions about important things. The problem is systematically confusing opinion with solid knowledge, superficial impression with deep analysis, emotional reaction with thoughtful reflection. The modern fake sage can't distinguish between really thinking and simply reacting to stimuli. For him, having a quick opinion about any subject is an automatic sign of superior intelligence. But Diogenes knew that haste is the mortal enemy of authentic wisdom. Those who really think about complex questions necessarily need time, silence, productive doubt. They need to chew ideas well, not just swallow and regurgitate them to an audience. True intellectual depth is always in listening more than talking, in questioning more than affirming, in doubting more than having cheap and comforting certainties. Diogenes practiced this depth while everyone else performed shallow spectacle. There's a fundamental and irreconcilable difference between being genuinely wise and just appearing socially smart. The smart person manipulates situations to stand out and impress. The wise person accepts appearing foolish if it brings him 1 millim closer to truth. Diogenes exemplified this perfectly in his daily life. He chose to live as a beggar, was constantly ridiculed by society's important people, but saw reality much better than any recognized authority. He preferred being authentic to being admired. The social smart person wants exclusively to win debates, never to discover truth about the subjects being debated. He uses sophisticated rhetorical tricks, strategically changes subjects when losing, attacks the person instead of discussing the ideas presented. His goal is always to dominate, never to understand. The genuine sage, however, wants to understand deeply, even if it means publicly admitting he was wrong about important questions. He asks sincere and vulnerable questions. Honestly, recognizes when he doesn't know something, changes his mind without drama when presented with better evidence. His goal is always to grow intellectually, never to impress audiences or build artificial reputation. He prefers being right alone than being wrong accompanied by enthusiastic crowds. Our contemporary society systematically rewards social cleverness and instinctively distrusts authentic wisdom. We admire those who can do well in any situation, even using completely dishonest methods. Diogenes would constantly remind us that this superficial cleverness is in fact a sophisticated form of profound stupidity, because in the end, those who live deceiving others invariably end up deceiving mainly themselves, and those who build their entire lives on top of appearances and manipulations end up completely without any real substance. They become actors who forgot who they really are underneath the mask. Many people strategically position themselves as spiritual gurus or intellectual mentors just to feed their own ego hungry for admiration. The false master desperately wants dependent disciples, never genuinely free people. He wants unconditional admiration, not authentic transformation. Diogenes deeply distrusted anyone who voluntarily presented themselves as a teacher or spiritual guide. He knew from experience that those who really have something valuable to teach do it mainly by living, not by eloquently discoursing about how one should live. Practical example always counts infinitely more than thousands of well-produced motivational speeches. Coherence between discourse and practice is the definitive test of any teaching. The true master constantly works to free his students from dependence, not to increase it. He teaches people to think autonomously for themselves, not to repeat his ideas like well-trained parrots. The false master, however, wants to create a legion of faithful followers who never question him about anything, who accept his teachings as absolute and unquestionable truth. How to clearly identify the difference in practice. The authentic master encourages uncomfortable questioning, publicly admits when he errs, honestly recognizes that he's also constantly learning. The false master gets irritated with questions he can't answer, never admits ignorance about any subject, consistently acts as if he were perfect and had already reached some superior state of consciousness. The vanity of teaching is especially dangerous because it simultaneously corrupts both the teacher and the learner. The vain teacher progressively becomes a prisoner of his own image as an enlightened sage. The dependent student never develops real intellectual autonomy. Diogenes would constantly remind us deeply, distrust anyone who wants to be your personal guru. The best teachers are always those who gradually teach you to dispense with all teachers, including themselves. Why do fake sages become so profoundly uncomfortable in the presence of genuinely authentic people? Because authenticity works like a merciless mirror. It reflects back all the carefully constructed falseness of others. Diogenes lived so genuinely and coherently that he just had to appear in any environment to automatically embarrass all the hypocrites present. He didn't need to do anything beyond simply being himself. His mere presence already dismantled all other social masks. This is the fundamental reason why authentic people are frequently attacked, ridiculed, isolated, or persecuted. They represent an existential threat to those who built their entire lives on top of elaborate pretenses. The fake sage invests so much time, energy, and mental resources maintaining his social facade that encountering someone genuine completely terrifies him. It's like a bright light suddenly entering a dark room. It instantly exposes all the dirt that was carefully hidden. That's why they instinctively prefer to surround themselves exclusively with other fake sages. That way nobody questions anybody and everyone can continue pretending in relative peace. It's a tacit agreement of collective illusion maintenance. They create social bubbles where hypocrisy is normalized and authenticity is seen as abnormal or even pathological behavior. Inside these bubbles, everyone pretends they're living in a full and meaningful way. Diogenes represented everything they most feared deep in their hearts. Someone who didn't need external approval to live, who didn't sell impossible dreams to desperate consumers, who lived his convictions independent of social consequences. A walking nightmare for anyone who built their success and reputation, selling illusions to masses, starved for meaning. Following the crowd obediently is always infinitely easier than assuming the responsibility of thinking alone. That's why so many people systematically prefer to fake collective wisdom rather than courageously face their own individual ignorance. It's much more comfortable to be wrong along with everyone than to be right alone in the corner. The solitude of truth scares more than the comforting company of shared lies. Diogenes understood that most people are usually wrong about the most fundamental questions of existence. After all, if truth about how to live were really popular and obvious, we wouldn't need courageous philosophers to constantly point it out. What everyone knows with absolute certainty rarely deserves our automatic trust. The most important truths are always counterintuitive and initially unpopular, but blindly following the herd has a terrible existential price. You gradually lose yourself completely in the process. Your opinions stop being genuinely yours and become distorted echoes of what you heard somewhere. Your unique personality progressively dissolves into the uniform mass. You become a clone without realizing it, repeating patterns you never consciously questioned. The fake sage is deep in his soul an existential coward. He doesn't have the courage to think differently from the majority, because that would mean being alone with his uncomfortable discoveries. He prefers shared certainties to solitary and productive doubts. This systematic intellectual cowardice literally transforms us into social zombies. We appear alive and thinking on the surface, but we just mechanically repeat behavioral patterns. We passively absorbed. We completely lose the capacity to question basic premises, to doubt established authorities, to rethink our fundamental beliefs in light of new evidence. Diogenes would challenge us head-on with the most important question. Is it really worth belonging to any group if the price is ceasing to be yourself? Isn't it objectively better to be alone with truth than accompanied by comforting but destructive lies? Excessive intellectual pride is one of the most sophisticated and destructive psychological prisons that exist. Those who fall madly in love with their own wisdom completely stop learning new things and become condemned to repeat the same ideas like a scratched record. Diogenes constantly observed this happening with the famous philosophers of his era. They gradually became slaves to their own theories. They defended obviously absurd positions just to avoid publicly admitting they were fundamentally wrong. The inflated ego became more important than the honest search for truth. Personal reputation was worth more than intellectual coherence. This chronic intellectual vanity creates terrible psychological resistance to genuine learning. The more we emotionally invest in a specific idea, the harder it becomes to abandon it when we discover evidence that it's wrong. It's like trying to demolish a house where we've lived comfortably for decades. Even knowing the structure is compromised, we resist the necessary demolition. The fake sage prefers to live in this ruined house rather than honestly admit he needs to rebuild everything from the foundation. He'll invent 1,000 creative excuses to justify evident cracks in the walls, leaks in the ceiling, serious problems in the foundation. Anything to avoid the hard work of starting from scratch. Anything to preserve the illusion that he always knew what he was talking about. The true sage, however, develops courage to demolish and restart as many times as necessary to get closer to truth. He understands profoundly that unlearning wrong concepts is as important as learning correct concepts. That releasing old and comfortable certainties is an essential condition for embracing new and transformative truths. Intellectual vanity systematically prevents us from growing because it keeps us eternally trapped in what we think we already know. And what we already know, however good it may be today, can always be improved or even completely replaced tomorrow. In a historical era of so much useless mental noise, reflective silence has paradoxically become the wisest possible response. Diogenes knew that not every provocation deserves comment. Not every controversy deserves our energy. Not every debate is worth the precious time we have. The contemporary fake sage has a neurotic compulsion to opine about absolutely everything that happens. He systematically confuses having a quick opinion with having something genuinely important to say. He can't stay quiet for even 5 minutes because he mistakes reflective silence for embarrassing ignorance. For him, not commenting on some subject is admitting he doesn't understand the subject. But Diogenes understood profoundly that silence can often be infinitely more eloquent than thousands of well-organized words. That sometimes not responding is objectively the best possible response. That not arguing can be the most powerful argument. The chronic problem of our era is that we've transformed human communication into constant and unnecessary noise. Everyone talks simultaneously. Nobody listens to anyone with real attention. The result is a deafening cacophony where the most important ideas are completely lost in the middle of the shouting. The reflective silence that Diogenes religiously practiced allows truly important ideas to settle naturally, allows genuine insights to mature away from the spotlights of public opinion, allows wisdom to develop organically without external pressure. Those who learn to use silence as a conscious communication tool have an enormous strategic advantage over those who only know how to make mental noise. They carefully choose their words, measure their interventions, speak only when they have something really relevant to contribute. This economy of words makes each intervention more impactful and memorable. Less really can be much more when it comes to meaningful communication. The true sage never fears appearing ridiculous in the eyes of the ignorant multitude. Diogenes was systematically ridiculed throughout his entire adult life and didn't lose a single minute of sleep because of it. He knew that the laughter of the masses is always the automatic defense of those who can't bear to confront naked truth. Why exactly does laughter work as a psychological defense mechanism? Because it's infinitely easier to disqualify an uncomfortable idea through ridicule than to face it seriously and discover it might be right. Collective laughter becomes a protective shield against transformative insights that could force people to change their comfortable way of seeing the world. Diogenes was publicly called crazy, a bum, mentally disturbed, socially maladjusted. If he lived today, he'd be called much worse things on social media. But he understood that being ridiculed for saying uncomfortable truths is a badge of honor, never a reason for shame or regret. The fake sage, on the contrary, has absolute terror of ridicule because he built his entire identity on top of others' approval and admiration. If people stop taking him seriously publicly, he literally ceases to exist as a person. That's why he carefully avoids any position that might cause laughter or questioning. He prefers to say obvious things that please the crowd than truths that make people uncomfortable. This neurotic need for constant approval makes us completely predictable and socially harmless. We say only what we know in advance will please our audience. We systematically avoid truths that might cause discomfort. We become professional diplomats of comforting lies, specialists in saying what people want to hear instead of what they need to hear. Diogenes would constantly remind us that really important ideas always cause significant initial discomfort. If everyone agrees with you immediately and without questioning, you probably didn't say anything genuinely relevant. Transformative truth necessarily needs time to be digested, processed, accepted. It's rarely popular at the moment it's presented. The fake sage is literally a slave to social appearances. He lives exclusively to maintain his carefully constructed public image, even if it means systematically betraying his deepest private convictions. His greatest concern is never being right about important questions, but just appearing respectable in the eyes of the society that constantly observes and judges him. Diogenes consciously made the diametrically opposite choice. Preserve his inner freedom and personal authenticity, even if it completely cost his established social respectability. He preferred to live as an authentic beggar than as a respectable but completely hypocritical citizen. He preferred uncomfortable truth to comforting lies. This slavery to appearances systematically corrupts us from within, creating a pathological division between our public persona and our private reality. We start caring much more about what others think of us than what we think of ourselves. Our internal moral compass becomes completely dependent on external approval. We lose contact with our authentic values and start living according to others' expectations. The inevitable result is a life of constant and suffocating anxiety. Am I making a good impression? Do they approve of my public opinions? Is my image adequately protected? We become voluntary prisoners of others' gaze, hostages to opinions of people we don't even know well. The true sage completely inverts this destructive logic. He worries primarily about his internal integrity and lets others freely think whatever they want about him. He knows from experience that those who live exclusively to please everyone end up pleasing not even themselves. That it's impossible to maintain authenticity while seeking universal approval. This inner freedom that Diogenes conquered through much work and sacrifice is exactly what we all unconsciously seek. The capacity to be genuinely authentic, independent of the social consequences this might bring. The courage to live consistently according to our deepest values, not according to others' changeable expectations. Diogenes made us an invitation that still echoes powerfully today, 2,000 years later. Finally, assume total responsibility for your own thinking. Stop immediately outsourcing your brain to external authorities, expert commentators, digital influencers, and occasional motivational gurus. Genuinely thinking for yourself takes real and constant work. It's infinitely easier to passively repeat what we read somewhere than to patiently develop our own conclusions through personal investigation. It's much more psychologically comfortable to follow established opinion leaders than to assume the frightening responsibility of forming genuinely personal opinions about complex questions. But this systematic intellectual laziness progressively transforms us into human puppets. Our ideas stop being ours and become poorly understood borrowings from others. Our values weren't consciously chosen. They were passively absorbed from the environment. Our personality wasn't carefully built through reflected experiences. It was simply copied from models we superficially admired. The challenge of genuinely thinking alone scares most people because it puts us face to face with our real ignorance about fundamental questions. It's much safer to pretend we know by repeating others' ideas than to honestly admit we don't know and start investigating on our own. But Diogenes would patiently remind us that this is the only real way to grow intellectually in an authentic manner. Assume our ignorance as a legitimate starting point, not as shame to desperately hide. From there, each genuine discovery becomes really ours, not borrowed from other thinkers. Each insight becomes an organic part of who we are, not a poorly fitted accessory. Truly autonomous thinking doesn't mean naively rejecting all external influence. It means consciously processing these influences through our personal critical filter, not just passively absorbing them like sponges. It means being mentally active in the process of forming our own ideas, not being mere passive consumers of prefabricated intellectual content. The great danger of not being constantly alert is becoming exactly what Diogenes so fiercely criticized: incompetent actors pretending to be wise. Without consciously realizing it, we enter the collective theater and start playing the role of people who know something important. It's frighteningly easy to fall into this social trap. Society constantly pressures us from all directions to have formed opinions about absolutely everything, to demonstrate knowledge about any subject, to always appear informed and updated. Those who have the humility to admit ignorance about some topic are automatically seen as intellectually inferior. Those who pretend to know are respected and admired independent of the real quality of their knowledge. So we gradually start pretending without even realizing it. We copy catchy phrases we heard somewhere, repeat analyses we read superficially, cite books we quickly skimmed without really understanding. Little by little, we build a completely false intellectual persona that can impress inattentive people but doesn't resist the slightest serious scrutiny. The problem is that the more we pretend to know, the less effectively we learn. We become so busy maintaining our artificial image of wisdom that we completely stop seeking authentic wisdom. We literally become prisoners of our own elaborate performance. Diogenes saw this self-destructive process constantly happening with his contemporaries and tried to wake them up with brutally honest provocations. He knew that pretending to know is objectively worse than admitting ignorance because it completely blocks the possibility of genuine learning. The solution is radical honesty with oneself. Courageously admit what we don't know. Systematically question what we think we know. Have courage to change our minds when presented with better evidence. It's a difficult and sometimes painful process, but it's the only real path to authentic wisdom as opposed to fake wisdom. Diogenes lived more than 2,000 years ago, but his message has never been as urgent and current as today. He reminds us that in a world completely full of unnecessary mental noise, personal authenticity is genuinely revolutionary. That amid the daily spectacle of industrialized false wisdom, having courage to admit ignorance is an act of rebellion against the system. The philosopher who chose to live as a beggar saw something that most people to this day refuse to see. We are literally surrounded by actors performing wisdom, while the truly wise prefer to stay quiet in corners observing the spectacle. This total inversion of values continues to completely dominate our society and probably intensify dramatically in the digital era, where anyone can appear to be an expert in anything. If this content made you question at least some of your most comfortable certainties and rethink some concepts you took for granted, then you really understood Diogenes' transformative message. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to access more reflections that go far beyond the obvious and common sense. And leave your like if you have the courage to genuinely think for yourself in this world, full of fools pretending to be wise.